Hello and welcome from me, Mike Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from Catherine Temple, Mike Collins, and Father Joe Simmons in Washington, DC. This is the 15th event in this series, which follows on from the Christian Literary Imagination series and our earlier series, Christian Shakespeare ? Which is now available as a book published by Vernon Press. And I'm pleased to say that we hope that the Christian Literary Imagination will soon be in book form by Vernon Press, probably next year. All three series are part of Georgetown University Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. In a moment, Catherine Temple will introduce today's speaker, Father Dr. Joseph Simmons. Your participation is as important as ever, so please type in any questions you have by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can do this from the moment we begin the session. We will endeavour to answer your questions in discussion with Catherine and the others towards the end of the event. Ensure, please, that you use the Q&A button and not the chat one. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Mike. I'm just so happy and delighted to welcome Joe Simmons today, as he's just been a crucial contributor to this project and to all of our collaborations with Oxford over the last couple of years, and a lovely colleague and my office mate for the past year here at Georgetown. So Joe received his bachelor's degree from Marquette in classical languages and Spanish, and his master's from Loyola University Chicago, where he focused on Charles Taylor's buffered self and the verifiability of religious experience. He just recently completed his doctoral studies, receiving a DPhil from Oxford University. And in fact, I just discovered that his graduation is this coming weekend. So congratulations. His dissertation is on Virginia Woolf and Marilynne Robinson and the Christian Imagination. And he's published several academic essays and a number of reviews. He's a frequent speaker on literature and the Christian imagination. In the fall, he'll be headed to Marquette University in Milwaukee, where he will serve as an assistant professor in the theology department. I'm very much looking forward to his paper today. The title is Nature Abhors a Vacuum, Overcoming Domesticity in Housekeeping. So at this point, I will turn it over to Joe and prepare to enjoy the paper. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you all of you joining. I know, at least in the United States, a lot of people are in the midst of preparing for graduation or having just come from graduation. So probably the last thing you want to be doing is sitting in front of a screen right now, but I'm grateful for your presence here today, and I hope you enjoy our paper and more importantly, the discussion that follows. So please feel free to put your questions below. The other day, it was a beautiful day outside, so I walked down to the National Gallery and there was a presentation on Dante. And outside of Dante's presentation, there was a reading from the first canto. Dante's Inferno begins with our narrator, Dante, encountering Virgil in a dark wood in the night before the dawn of Good Friday. And it begins, in the middle of the journey of our life, I'll find myself in a dark forest where the direct path was lost. It is a hard thing to speak of, how wild, rough, and impenetrable that wood was, so that thinking of it recreates the fear. It is scarcely less bitter than death, but in order to tell of the good that I found there, I must tell of other things I saw there. In the middle of the life of Marilynne Robinson, she set out to write her first long piece of fiction, a short novel called Housekeeping. It is on the surface the story of generations of women negotiating a life of domesticity. Early readings of the novel saw it primarily as a feminist text, rejecting gender roles of women's confinement to the home in the American frontier. But subsequent readings reveal layers of interpretation and a treasure trove of meanings that cannot themselves be neatly domesticated or even articulated. Today, I want to argue that housekeeping is a very deft treatment of how humans attempt to domesticate many aspects of our life. First, our human relationships with one another. Second, how we attempt to domesticate the natural world. Third, how we domesticate religious experience. And finally, how human language, including literature like this very book, attempts to domesticate, to articulate all of these other areas of our life. But before we get into this domesticity, I offer a bit of a biography of our author, Marilynne Robinson, and some of the intellectual influences that I think are at play in her fiction. Marilynne Summers was born in the small town of Sandpoint, Idaho in 1943. She had a rather distant father and spent much of her childhood with her mother, Ellen, and her brother, David. Her bookishness stemmed from her own youthful curiosity. As a child, she reports, relevance was precisely not an issue for me, and so she steeped herself in, quote, old and thick and hard books that others might pass over. Her brother David used to come home from school to share what he had learned. In her dedication to the book, When I Was a Child, I Read Books, she calls him her first and best teacher. As children, he thought he was going to become a painter and that she would be a poet. He became a scholar of Renaissance art, and she dabbled in poetry long before turning to fiction and essays. One unpublished poem from her teen years evoked The Raven by Poe, whom she admired. Her poem goes like this: now I lie in silence, fearing that some sound escape my hearing, so that I might lose the pattern of the tread. My exaggerated senses make an end to all pretenses of composure, and they leave me sick with dread. Robinson jokes in a recent interview that it was a bit of a hackneyed poem by a teenager, but even at 15, she was keyed into the importance of the senses and the twin dangers of, on the one hand, entirely missing the world's perceptible patterns, and on the other, overanalyzing what the senses do in fact gather. This theme will emerge later in our discussion of how the human subject, how we relate to the natural world around us. So young Marilynne Summers attended public secondary education, by which I mean state schools for those of you in the UK. And her school was 60 miles south of Sandpoint in Coeur d'Alene. She writes warmly of her public education, which provided her with, quote, odds and ends, Dido pining on her flaming couch, Lewis and Clark mapping the wilderness, as well as an addition to a robust classical education in Horace, Virgil, and Cicero. Where her fictional dialogue is marked by the understatement of Hemingway, she suggests that overall her style is considerably more indebted to Cicero than to Hemingway. I think this is a telling observation, since her essays read like Cicero, while the spare prose of her fiction sounds a lot more like Hemingway. After high school, Marilynne Robinson studied English literature at Pembroke College, a women's college that later merged into Brown University in 1971. She focused heavily on 19th century American literature, as is clear from her essays. After graduation in 1966, she returned to the Pacific Northwest, where she got married, had 2 sons, and pursued her doctorate at the University of Washington. In 1977, she completed her dissertation, A New Look at Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 2, Sources, Structure, and Meaning. Then she moved to France to teach for a year at the Université de Haute-Bretagne. Shortly after that time in France, she published Housekeeping in 1980, a story composed from the scraps of ideas, images, and metaphors that she had been collecting while writing her dissertation. After teaching at several American universities through the 1980s, she spent a formative year living in England. While there, she tracked environmental degradation from nuclear waste in Sellafield, England, which resulted in her book, Mother Country, Britain, the Welfare State, and Nuclear Pollution. She divorced in 1989 and in 1990 accepted a position at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop, where she taught and wrote vigorously until she retired in 2016. Now, for those new to her writing, Robinson, I would say, is a consummate contrarian. She avoids parroting other people's opinions. Her essays engage in forceful disputation of what are thought to be settled ideas. Despite her progressive politics, Robinson regularly criticizes feminist scholars, and she rejects the impulse in the American Academy to dismiss considerations of religious faith. Despite her forceful defense of ocean preservation in her book, Mother Country, she was sued by Greenpeace. There is, for Robinson, no unalloyed enemy or ally. She combats both an atheistic rejection of religious belief and combats the voices of politicized Christianity that find only a cause for war with contemporary culture. In her essays and fiction alike, she rehabilitates figures consigned to the naughty list of history, Puritans and Pilgrims, Oliver Cromwell and John Calvin, to name just a few. I want to turn now to some of the influences that led Robinson to write Housekeeping, the focus of our talk. Robinson draws heavily on the 19th century American transcendentalist tradition, the likes of Emerson, Thoreau, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, and even Emily Dickinson. These transcendentalists shied away from explicit religious affiliation, teaching instead that divinity pervades all nature and humanity. Their interest lay in human subjectivity and humanity's place in and alienation from the natural world. Drawing on Platonic thought and Romanticism, transcendentalism emerged as a distinctly American response to a rationalist confidence, a confidence in the human mind to dominate and perfectly grasp what surrounds us. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, was fascinated by man's attempt to domesticate the disordered chaos found in nature. He wrote that for the American builder of destiny, quote, "Nature is thoroughly mediate. It is made to serve. It receives the dominion of man, who is never weary of working it. He reduces all things until the world becomes at last only a realized will, the double of the man." In other words, man trying to encapsulate in his mind all of creation. Those of you who attended last week will remember Mike Collins' treatment of the archetypal figure heading to the American West, taming nature and shaping his own destiny. In short, American expansion was based on manifest destiny, a perceived divine right of the autonomous individual. Another 19th century American writer, Nathaniel Hawthorne, laments the mind's attempt to domesticate nature. He writes, "We who are born into the world's artificial system can never adequately know how little in our present state and circumstances is natural, and how much is merely the interpolation of the perverted mind and heart of man." End quote. The retelling of this narrative in culture yields further an alienation from nature. Hawthorne concludes, quote, "Art has become a second and stronger nature, whose crafty tenderness has taught us to despise the bountiful and wholesome ministration of our true parent," end quote. The true parent, of course, being nature. It is precisely this wounded relationship of humanity trying to domesticate the natural world that Robinson takes up as a starting place in Housekeeping. So let us turn to a brief summary of the book and analyze some of its implications for our series on art, literature, and the environment. I mentioned earlier that Robinson's dissertation focused on Shakespeare, and she was nearly 40 years old before she started writing Housekeeping. Her debut novel was never written to be published, she would later say. She wanted to see instead if she could write a story with images and metaphors that struck her fancy and kept her interest while she was writing a dissertation and raising two small boys. I can imagine her study littered with crumpled strips of paper and 3x5 note cards stuck in old books and drawers that wouldn't close. From these stray ideas and images emerged the novel Housekeeping, which reads sort of like an impressionistic painting. We hear the narrator, Ruth's interior life, as she moves from the intergenerational challenges of family life into the haunts of nature and memory and all that lies hidden below the surface of a lake in the town, but also below the surface of her own consciousness. The novel begins with a laconic introduction. "My name is Ruth." Here we see Robinson's homage to Melville's Moby Dick, which similarly begins, "Call me Ishmael." Robinson has noted in interviews that after the Bible, Moby Dick is her favorite book. Here we have two protagonists with names that echo second-order biblical characters. Ishmael, the firstborn son of Abraham and Hagar, who is the attendant of his barren wife, Sarah. Recall from the Bible that eventually Abraham's wife, Sarah, was able to bear a son, Isaac. And so the characters of Ishmael and Hagar were banished into the wilderness. And Robinson in her novel begins with the character of Ruth, another biblical character whose name is probably familiar, but whose story is little known or remembered. The book of Ruth recounts the life of Ruth and Orpah, two women from Moab, which is across the River Jordan from Judah in modern-day Western Jordan. Ruth and Orpah both married two sons of Naomi and her husband Elimelech, a family that had fled famine in their homeland and settled in Moab. The husbands of all three of these women die, and the matriarch, Naomi, plans to leave Moab for her native Bethlehem in Judah, and she urges her daughters-in-law to return to their families as well. Orpah goes back to her family, but Ruth refuses to leave the side of Naomi, declaring, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried." I think there's a parallel here between Ishmael and Ruth. Where Ishmael and his mother were banished into the wilderness, Ruth accompanies her mother-in-law, Naomi, into the wilderness of Judah, back to the town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the city of both King David and later Jesus. So ultimately, this outsider, Ruth, is grafted into the line of David, is grafted into the root of Jesse, is grafted into the life of Christ. These subtle biblical allusions, both in Moby Dick and echoed here in Housekeeping, reveal something of a double allusion that Robinson is doing, alluding both to a work of fiction and also to scripture that fiction is drawing on. It's a very subtle and a deft move. But back to housekeeping and my first point that I'd like to focus on, which is the difficulty of domesticating our human relationships. Ruth gives an account of her small family, her sister Lucille, her grandparents Edmund and Sylvia, her mother Helen, and her aunts Molly and Sylvie. Long before Ruth was born, her grandfather Edmund charged westward from the Midwest to build a homestead outside the fictitious mountain town of Fingerbone, Idaho. Edmund worked long hours from the railroad and left child rearing and housekeeping to his wife, Sylvia. There's a large black lake next to the mountain town that regularly rises at the moon's command, which floods cellars and fills backyards with the smell of earthy decay and pools of dark water. The series of untimely deaths throughout housekeeping reads like Greek tragedy, or perhaps like the Book of Ruth. On one moonless evening, a, quote, black and sleek and elegant train sails off of the bridges that passes over the town's lake, which sends all of the passengers, including Grandpa Edmund, to their watery grave. Local boys and men attempt immediately to find the survivors, but they can't determine how or where the train settled on the lake's bed. Soon the ice of winter seals the lake over. There are only 2 survivors who were standing at the back of the caboose when the train derailed. But Robinson writes with a wink, they were not really witnesses in any sense, for the equally sound reasons that the darkness was impenetrable to any eye, and because they had been standing at the end of the train, looking backward. We are given to understand that human rationality and human perception are not all that they seem. So after abandoning Ruth and Lucille at Grandma Sylvia's house, their free-spirited mother, Helen, drives a borrowed car off of a cliff into that same dark lake where her own father Edmund had died. I note here, as I did last week, that the film Thelma and Louise, where they drive off a cliff, that came about 11 years after this book was published, and I'm pretty sure there's some inspiration from it. So Lucille and Ruth's mother has committed suicide into the lake by driving off. She leaves no note of intention. There's no trace of her sunken car in the lake. We are left both not understanding another human's intentions and not knowing how the natural world swallowed her up. In spite of all attempts to comprehend one another and our attempts to domesticate nature, the mysterious world beyond us and the world between humans remains inscrutable and indomesticable. Eventually, their earthy aunt Sylvie, reminiscent of the word sylvan, as in of the forest, their aunt Sylvie becomes the sister's guardian. Much like the biblical Ruth being taken in by her mother-in-law Naomi, Ruth and her sister have replaced their own mother with a new guardian. Aunt Sylvia detests living in the family home. She serves dinner only after sunset, leaving the lights off to let the sounds of outside float in to occupy the home. Ruth and Lucille's domesticated lives are fragilized. The new routines of their house under Sylvie cannot provide any stability. Their clothes are dirty, they skip school, the house floods and fills with leaves. Ruth's sister Lucille eventually fights this return to nature, insisting that the lights be turned on while they eat, and cleaning the house herself to restore order and cleanliness. But like Sylvie, young Ruth grows to resent domestication, preferring long days at the lake to staying indoors or going to school. This, I think, accounts for the second theme I highlight of housekeeping, the human desire to buffer ourselves from the natural world by combating nature's forces. In her book, The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt distinguishes, quote, the private realm of domestic life from the outward-facing public realm. The former, the private life, demands labor, which is, as she says, the constant, unending fight against the processes of growth and decay through which nature forever invades human artifice, threatening the durability of the world and its fitness for human use. End quote. But even this language of decay, Arendt maintains, reflects an anthropocentric artifice where nature's unpredictable forces are viewed as threats that we must impose stability to. And so the act of housekeeping hopes to safeguard this private realm, to safeguard a home from the encroachment of nature and decay, insects and vermin, dirt and dust, flooding and feral animals and leaves. The house itself serves as a metaphor for the buffered personal identity, which, in a world governed by human artifice, human creation, requires constant curating. For the generations of women in Robinson's novel, housekeeping connotes self-preservation, keeping away the forces of nature by sheer force of human will. When Ruth's grandfather, mother, and grandmother die in succession, their ancestral duties fall away, but so does the protection that those duties afforded them. Lucille begins to panic at this lack of domestic structure, and their home economics teacher, Miss Royce, gives Lucille a spare room in her home, effectively adopting her. But Aunt Sylvie and Ruth embrace the decay and return to nature. They let the house fall into ruin. A related element of housekeeping, as I mentioned above, is to challenge the rationalism or the period of rationalism that the transcendentalists were arguing against. This has to do something with what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls the buffered self in relation to the natural world. The buffered self being the individual who imagines is impervious to everything that is outside of one's head, that I am kind of the gatekeeper of anything that comes in or comes out. In opposition to this, Charles Taylor proposes the idea of the porous self, one who recognizes there is an openness or a porosity between myself and the natural world, between my mind and what exists outside of my mind. I think this gets cashed out in the text a little bit, because one night when Ruth and Lucille stay overnight in the woods, Ruth embraces the moonless darkness of nature, but Lucille grows uncomfortable. Quote, "It was so dark that creatures came down to the water within a few feet of us. We could not see what they were. Lucille began to throw stones at them. They're supposed to be able to smell us," she grumbled, never accepting that her human boundaries were overrun. End quote. Suddenly, Marilynne Robinson gives an account of Ruth's sense of porosity, a sense of union with the natural world that echoes the transcendentalist forebears that she was drawing on. This is a longer quote that I'll read. Lucille would tell this story differently. Lucille would say, "I fell asleep, but I did not. I simply let the darkness in the sky become coextensive with the darkness in my skull and bowels and bones. Everything that falls upon the eye is apparition, a sheet dropped over the world's true workings. The nerves and the brains are tricked, and one is left with dreams that these specters loose their hands from ours and walk away. Darkness is the only solvent." End quote. Ruth's Aunt Sylvie has led her from a domesticated, buffered life to one where her interior world and the outer natural world can merge in something like an Emersonian transcendence. The scholar Joan Kirkby reads in Ruth's experience, quote, "a sense of wholeness without separation, a dissolution in which the ego's grasp of the self loosens and the boundaries between the self and the world dissolve," end quote. Later, Ruth notes again a correspondence between the space within the circle of my skull and the space around me, which leads her finally to hide in the wilderness and refuse to inhabit the house her grandfather built. And so in a grand gesture of defiance, she and Sylvie attempt to burn down the house and flee from it. But they find that their family home, this human fortress against natural decay, their projection of a buffered self, this too has become damp and dank, swallowed by the natural environment around it. Swallowed by the natural environment it was built to keep out. Even this willful act of destruction, arson, is foiled by natural elements. The house, like the self, is far less buffered than we have been given to believe. The third theme I wish to highlight in Robinson's writing is how to give language to religious experience without domesticating it. So to that, we now turn. If the book Housekeeping treats religious belief, it's not a religious belief that is easily domesticated by any Christian denomination. We have characters who go about doing salvation by good deeds. It's something distinctive in the town's churches, quote, and the obligation to perform these works rested squarely with the women, since salvation was universally considered to be much more becoming in women than in men, end quote. Hence, when the churchy women of Fingerbone appeal to Ruth and Sylvie, Ruth balks at their desire, quote, a determination to keep me, so to speak, safely within doors, end quote. Ruth's wariness of churches notwithstanding, Robinson draws heavily on biblical tales of woe. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the ark, Rachel, Job, Absalom, and Jesus commanding the disciples to become fishers of men. But Robinson challenges the religious-minded reader to imagine too, quote, all of the nameless women, end quote, whose names were lost or not included, like those lost on the train that sank into the lake in town. Housekeeping's nearly exclusive treatment of female characters goes a long way to round out the imbalance and the silence of biblical representation. But Ruth, like her biblical forebear, is separated from her true home. And so she finds in the novel the character of Noah, sort of a kindred, picaresque spirit. She imagines with her mind's eye Noah eagerly knocking down his house and using the planks to build an ark, with neighbors looking on in doubt. Quote, a house should have a compass and a keel, she concludes, and reasons that looking out at the lake, one could believe that the flood had never ended, end quote. If one's world is going to flood anyways, the stable foundations of what humans construct offers little solace. Robinson intimates that Ruth, like her biblical forebears, is a spiritual nomad, a nomad on the sea of uncertainty. Recall that after the Bible, Robinson's favorite book is Melville's Moby Dick, a tale of humanity's fragile place upon the sea. In Housekeeping, the surface of Fingerbones Lake is the dividing line between the phenomenal world of what we see above and this numinous world of memories and dreams of the dead, of her mother, her grandfather, her grandmother, and all of her other ancestors below. Ruth describes the world above as hardly a human world, here in the fatuous light. This strange phrase, fatuous light, is an homage to Emily Dickinson's poem, 1551, Those Dying Then, about a loss of certainty in life after death. Allow me a little reading of that beautiful poem. Those dying then knew where they went. They went to God's right hand. That hand is amputated now, and God cannot be found. The abdication of belief makes the behavior small, better an ignis fatuus than no lumen at all. Dickinson refers to the ignis fatuus, the foolish, fatuous light of religious belief, but she kind of misses it because it at least provided some solace to the question of where we go after death. In other words, to the right hand of God. By comparison, Ruth has no understanding of what lies below the surface of the lake. In other words, no understanding of life after death. Below the lake's opaque surface, quote, is always the accumulated past, which vanishes but does not vanish, which perishes and remains, end quote. Her five senses, though important for observing the phenomenal world above the lake, these are not the extent of our capacities for intuition about what lies beneath. Earlier, as Ruth and Sylvie float across the lake in a boat, they wonder whatever happened to that train that fell in, with the memories of its buried dead. Ruth waxes philosophically, quote, the wreck of my grandfather's train is more vivid in my mind than it would have been if I had seen it, for the mind's eye is not utterly baffled by darkness, end quote. The limits of our sensory perception of the physical world are not evidently the limits of our capacity for sound intuitions. There is epistemic ground, that is, ground of how we come to know things, if not an explicit argument, for attending to the data of our consciousness, of what comes to our senses. But the supernatural world beyond the sensible, what lies above or what lies beneath the lake, but the supernatural world beyond the sensible is not in some distant heaven, but buried in the placid, impenetrably deep dark lake. Robinson masterfully embeds the limits of our incomprehension and our perception. Even here in this natural world, our buffered perception of reality is not always tidy, after all. In an essay that she wrote on Psalm 8, she writes, "I have spent my life watching not to see beyond the world, but merely to see great mystery, what is plainly before my eyes. I think the concept of transcendence is based on a misreading of creation. With all due respect to heaven, the scene of miracle is here among us." End quote. This leads to the final movement of my presentation, a consideration of how language ultimately fails to grasp and domesticate reality. In a 1993 interview in Madison, Wisconsin, Marilynne Robinson speaks of the language she used in housekeeping as a means of exploring transcendent reality and all of the muck that we've been looking at so far. She said in this interview, "I love 19th century American literature. I was particularly impressed with use of metaphor in all of the great ones, Melville, Dickinson, Thoreau. It seemed to me that the way they used metaphor was a highly legitimate strategy for real epistemological questions, to be dealt with in fiction and poetry. In some profound sense, reality is of a piece. It's sort of like finding a genetic strand that opens a whole genealogy. It seems to me that reality must somehow be describable as linked through analogs." End quote. All of reality, she seems to be saying, cannot be neatly contained by human cognition or even words, but we render it partially understood with our human language. We understand reality through metaphor, evocative images, and analogy. The writers Robinson admires were, quote, "using all of the resources of the language while absolutely insisting that language is not an appropriate tool," end quote. Human language is an imperfect tool for the writer and for us considering reality, because like someone trying to tidy up our house entirely, keeping out all of the dirt and the leaves and the rain and the flood, it has its own logic that drifts towards self-invited order, which yields too neat descriptions of reality. Hence, in the novel Housekeeping, as with her later novels Gilead and Beyond, Robinson refrains from some didactic explanation of what all of these impressionistic scenes mean that she paints. One example, and a beautiful one, is Ruth and Lucille digging out the old family dictionary in order to look up the term pinking shears before they set out to make a dress of newly purchased materials. When they open up to the P section of the dictionary, they find 5 dried pansies, different colors, all flat and stiff, quote, "as rigid as butterfly wings, but much more fragile," end quote. They found dried roses under R and orchids are under O. Lucille angrily overturns the dictionary and shakes it free of scores of flowers and petals. Ruth is marveled by this and asks what they will do with all of these beautiful flowers. Lucille suggests that they burn them in the stove and get back to sewing a dress. Words and nature competing, but yet mingled together. The reader is left to grasp and intuit the meaning of this vignette. When asked how she went about writing Housekeeping, Robinson explained, "If you put this story element in relation to that one, what is implied?" And the first thing I would think is, well, not much or nothing. And then, well, it was strange. I mean, I could intuit something I felt was like a movement or a principle of unity, but I didn't know what it was, end quote. And so we, the reader, work with Robinson through the text, recognizing their grandfather's desire to domesticate and preserve flowers by naming them and putting them together, collated with dictionary entries. And we see Lucille has no interest in bringing more flora into the home. In fact, she wants to expel it. One finds in Robinson's fiction sentences that invite the reader to pause and ruminate. She offers these hints of the divine without being explicit or ham-fisted with her descriptions. She writes elsewhere, "If I knew what the final meaning of a passage was, I didn't proceed. The whole interest of the book for me was in trying to be beyond my own grasp and outside my expectations. I tried to set problems for myself that I truly experienced as real problems. In a way, what I was doing was testing my method, finding what I could make it yield. Of course, if I had had any commitment beforehand to what it should have yielded, then I would have been ruining my experiment, end quote. Like Ruth herself, Robinson is wary of the fatuous light of language, which domesticates what it cannot fully contain. She writes, there really are thousands of different ways of thinking about things, and we can't demonstrate that contemporary methods locally applied are more interesting or more conducive to health or survival or anything than others, end quote. We're nearing the end. In her 2012 essay, Imagination and Community, Marilynne Robinson argues that in failing to describe the mysterious, human language nevertheless succeeds. Quote, demonstrations of the failures of language are paradoxically demonstrations of the extraordinary power of language to evoke a reality beyond its grasp, to evoke a sense of what cannot be said. Robinson's own hope in fiction is to create space for the ineffable to speak. She writes, I continually attempt to make inroads on the vast terrain of what cannot be said, or said by me at least. That is to say, the unnamed is overwhelmingly present and real for me, end quote. Like Ruth's fascination with the opaque dark lake and Fingerbone, Robinson is drawn beyond this phenomenal world because of her desire to understand what lies beneath our grasp. We live on a little island of the articulable, she writes, which we tend to mistake for reality itself. We can and do make small and tedious lives as we sail through the cosmos on our uncannily lovely little planet, and this is surely remarkable. But we do so much else besides. For example, we make language, end quote. I haven't spoken about Robinson's other novels, including Gilead. In that novel, she has John Ames, the Congregationalist minister who is observing all of reality and the beauty of nature. She has him say a very arresting line. This is an interesting planet. It deserves all the attention you can give it. I would argue that this same principle applies to what happens in Housekeeping. For the novel ends with Ruth saying, facts explain nothing. It is fact that requires explanation. Indeed, Marilynne Robinson's novel Housekeeping is a study in the limits of domesticated living, but also of domesticating our knowledge of one another, of the natural world, of religious experience, and ultimately of the language we deploy to describe reality itself. I mentioned earlier the line from her essay on Psalm 8, with which I will conclude, where she writes, I have spent my life watching not to see beyond the world, but merely to see, great mystery, what is plainly before my eyes. I think the concept of transcendence is based on a misreading of creation. With all due respect to heaven, the scene of miracle is here among us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that lovely paper, and the way you closed the paper also just is very moving. So I appreciate it. We do have a question from Timothy Green, and it really goes to the heart of what you're speaking about. And it is, could you please articulate a definition of domestication as you've employed it in the lecture? Okay, big question.
Well, it's certainly a big question. And I guess what my talk was attempting to do is sort of problematize or look at that word itself as if through a prism to say, what are the different levels of domesticity that we're speaking of here? So at the very basic level, it's in early reception, it was seen as, oh, well, this is a story of women overcoming being bound to their houses and domesticated as taking care of just the private realm, as Hannah Arendt would say. But I'm saying too that it's also about how do we domesticate, or how do we kind of simplify for human understanding? How do we try to simplify and make things easier, rather complex relationships between ourselves and one another, relationships between ourselves and the natural world around us, between ourselves and religious experiences of the numinous. But then ultimately, her reflection is sort of a meta-reflection on trying to domesticate reality, trying to encapsulate or capture reality with human language. And we find in writing or reading poetry or reading novels, we realize that our words are beautiful because they are limited and because they can't totally quite wrap their hands around all of reality. So I hope, does that kind of answer the question for you, Timothy? If not, you can write a follow-up one perhaps. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Okay, well, hopefully somebody will add to that, but just on this issue of domesticity, I was thinking about in Robinson, the difference between like the secular home, right, which eventually decays because of the water damage, right, and a sort of spiritual home, right, and which is still a domestication, right?
A domestication of the spiritual home, you're saying?
Of the spiritual, I don't know. I don't have the language to talk about this either.
That's okay.
Which makes all my words very beautiful, but but no, if you're, I'm sort of thinking of a minister who lives a block away from me. At one point during COVID, I ran into him and said, "How are things going at the church with COVID?" And he said, "I don't really live in this world. I really live in the world, in the spiritual world with God. And so we just don't pay attention to that." But so I guess that's the kind of dichotomy that I'm looking at, the actual sort of secular home versus the spiritual home that's being created in the novel.
Understood. Yeah, I think, I mean, to this pastor's thing, I would probably respectfully disagree with this conception. I mean, one of the abiding questions for theologians is, what is the connection point between all of reality and the visible world in which we live and move and have our being? And the point of this man, Jesus Christ, is coming to kind of bridge the gap of the infinite, the invisible, to help us understand the pathway back to God, because we are bounded in physical time and space with limits of human cognition. And so the theater in which God chooses to reveal the pathway back to God is in fact this human domain. So there's a danger in over-exaggerating the difference between the spiritual domain and the immanent domain, the domain of our human experience, because we are spiritual beings bound in physical time and space. And so the very struggles that humans go through happen nowhere else but in this physical time and space. And so there is a desire certainly to kind of separate, well, what are kind of the spiritual questions from what are the questions of, like, how much does a gallon of milk cost, right? So there's certain ways of kind of carving up the pie of reality. But what I would say is, the Christian vision would say, this is the theater where God chooses to speak to us and challenges us through our desires and everything else. And what you're seeing with these characters of Ruth and Sylvie is they're having robust spiritual lives, but they're not interested in doing that in any kind of a formal religious environment. They're not interested in going into a church. And yet throughout the novel, we see constant questions, constant biblical allusions, and all of the questions that play in the hearts of religious believers and non-believers alike. And so what I think what it does is it kind of reveals that even those who wouldn't claim any particular religious tradition, nevertheless are drawing from that tradition, but also that their questions are very similar to the questions that people of faith would be dealing with on a regular basis. Does that kind of answer your question?
That is goes way beyond answering my question and just provokes much thought and appreciation for your response. So one thing we do have another question, but I just want to ask you one thing about the novel. It's probably been 5 years since I read it, but one of my impressions was that nature is extremely seductive to these girls, young women. And I just wondered what you made of that.
When you say seductive, as in being kind of led away from something?
Calling them, they can't resist it. They spend the night out, they repeatedly are out in nature when it almost seems they didn't quite intend to be.
Yeah, I think, there's sort of almost a force of Mother Nature that kind of lulls them out or draws them out. I haven't really thought about that. And so whether it's sort of nature drawing them out, or if there's repugnance from domestication, it's hard to say. I use the title Nature Abhors a Vacuum, which is sort of playing on the idea that nature does not want someone hoovering up the leaves and everything like that. But also uh, that there is an attraction that happens even in the absence of things, that there will be movements that happen. And so to the extent that, like, we see in the novel, the moon's tidal rhythms, and I'm no scientist, so I don't understand how this works, but somehow the moon controls the ebb and flow of the tides. And so too of this lake, like, it's like nature is reaching into the house and saying, I'm drawing you, I'm drawing this house into myself. And so this novel was written before Marilynne Robinson really got into Calvinism and more explicitly religious writers. And so I think this is very different from her later novels. I think she is sort of playing with this idea that there is some sort of a spirit in nature operative. Like I was saying earlier, these transcendentalists saw the divine energies sort of permeating the human and nature, and was not really the exclusive domain of any kind of alternate realm where God is commanding things, but that it's embedded very much in nature. So I think there is sort of a seductive, attractive element to that too. And I mean, I think it's a fascinating novel because it characterizes so much of the desire to, when faced with domesticity or being kind of, felt like you're hemmed in, like going out and exploring the world in a big way.
Yeah, it makes me think of these arguments about modernity and the way in our age, everything has to be analyzed and categorized and separated and cleaned up, right?
Mhm.
And the resistance to that. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. The next one is from Tony and Ayude. To what extent was Robinson influenced by psychoanalytic thinking, especially Jung, as there seem to be some resonances, though I do not know much about the details?
I don't know. She doesn't write about Jung as far as I know. She does talk about in her book of essays, Absence of Mind, which I have ready to hand right here. How convenient. She kind of pushes against what she talks about parascientific literature. And she's not a scientist, let alone a neuroscientist, but she dabbles herself in these things. And she says there's sort of a whole school of psychologism and things that would reduce human experience to just, oh, these are just sort of archetypes that we find in literature. So whether it's Jung or Hero of a Thousand Faces, or Joseph Campbell, she's saying, as I recall her argument, that just because you can identify things with psychological language, of these are tropes that we see throughout literature, does not mean that there's not something more deeply embedded in all of these things. So I think she would maybe tip her head to say, okay, Carl Jung, you've identified these things, but that doesn't mean that you can just reduce them to mere psychologism or just mere, that there's something deeper that they're tapping into. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and that seems to be the whole point of housekeeping, right? The deep lake that's not accessible. There's always something deeper there that you can't get to.
But she's clearly playing with some, conceptions of deeper psychology. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a historian of that. So I'm open to being challenged on it. But she's playing with what is below. She's using well, no, never mind. She doesn't use Kantian categories. I'm doing kind of the numinous and the phenomenal worlds. But she is interested in what lies sort of beneath our consciousness. So to that extent, she's engaging with the same domain of what Jung is doing. She's doing it, though, I think, through literature.
So Adrian Vagenis asks, do you get a sense that there's a tension between Robinson's Calvinism and the sacramentalism present in the novels?
Well, that's a good question. There's the sacramentality of that we're talking about, I think, appears more in Gilead and her later novels, because that's when she's reading Christian Institutes, these works of Calvin. And actually, I mean, I've often said that I'm not sure John Calvin would recognize the Calvinism that she's proposing, because she has a deeply sacramental vision of things. And yet she's able to find threads within Calvin's thought which identify about sacramentality of nature and of creation, and that nature is she talks drawing on some piece by Calvin saying that creation is the theater and God is in the audience and watching us sort of living this out, so that there's a sacramentality to this natural world. So I think, at least in her reading of Calvin, there's not a strong disconnect between sacramentality and creation. But it's not, hers is not quite like a Catholic conception of sacramentality, but I think it's closer to a Catholic conception of sacramentality than to a traditional reading maybe of Calvin. That would be my take on the question. Thank you. Excellent question.
I think there is a question in the chat from Mike. Do you want to just ask your question, Mike?
Was thinking of a relationship between Ruth and Huckleberry Finn. You know, I can see the relationship between Ishmael and Ruth, Melville's Ishmael,
Right.
and Ruth, but also wondered about Huckleberry Finn. Or Ruth doesn't seem to want to get civilized, as Huckleberry Finn would put it. She's at home in nature and not doesn't want to be domesticated the way Huckleberry Finn doesn't want to be domesticated. I just wonder if there's any relationship there, or it's just simply part of the overall American imagination that comes up with these two comparable characters without any explicit connection between them.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've not come across anything that she's written where she talks about Mark Twain and, drawing in any of his. I think it's something in the water, though. I mean, often when I think of what does Ruth look like, I picture the film version of To Kill a Mockingbird, little scout with her kind of short haircut and kind of scrappy and tomboyish, and that to my mind. But I can see very much where you'd be drawing on Huck Finn. Anything in particular that stood out for you, Mike?
Yeah. Well, no, just that she doesn't want to be civilized. She's more comfortable in nature, in the woods, away from the people who want to drag her off to school and so on. And it's she has many of the characteristics that Twain invests Huckleberry Finn with. But it may be, it's just in the American grain. Those are the kind of people that, or kind of characters that get focused on. There's the other one, A Member of the Wedding, Carson McCullers play, in which the young girl is Frankie, and she's sort of she provides some of the critical distance on what's going on in the play. So it just seemed to me there was a lot of affinity between them, and I wondered whether, as you say, it's in the water or in the air, or whether there was some explicit connection that she was or that she was drawing on, put it that way. Yeah.
No, I don't think so. Not that I can think of. I don't think she has any characters sitting in the rafters observing their own funeral or anything like that.
Yeah.
You can see Mark Twain, but
I mean, there is a persistent thread in 20th century literature in the U.S. Of these young girls who want to escape domesticity, right? So I think as you started, I think you started out, Joe, by talking about the initial responses to the novel as feminist, as a feminist novel, and then gradually the readings became richer and more complex. But I think that is one legitimate reading.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was. No, I'm not. I just say these are all kind of levels of explanation.
Oh, no, I love that.
So it's. I love her, and as you guys all know, I also work very much with Virginia Woolf. And what I find funny is I don't think Marilynne Robinson likes Virginia Woolf very much, or the modernist movement, because she's always interested, as I said, in kind of disrupting narratives of like where do ideas come from. And so she says, there's T.S. Eliot, Marilynne Robinson, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster. They're always kind of like, they're kind of thinking they're the champions of interiority and the modernist movement. She says the American transcendentalists were talking about this half a century before in the United States, and championing kind of human subjectivity. So I find her always sort of funny and disruptive of narratives. And I would love to have dinner with Marilynne Robinson sometime. Marilynne, if you're watching, I doubt it, but I would love to sit and pick your brain a little bit more on this.
We all would, I think, yeah. So I think I can just ask one more question. I was really fascinated by by what you said about her initially writing poetry. Right. And Housekeeping has many sort of poetic, lyrical moments, right? If one of the issues is that language tries to lock down meaning, and we can't really express we can't express everything that we want to express. In poetry, the line breaks are often said to function as a way of breaking it, of showing process rather than product.
Right, yeah.
Whereas in prose, the sentences are always like, here's a finished sentence, here's another finished sentence. It's all product. So I'm just very curious about why, given her goals in housekeeping, why she would have abandoned poetry.
That's a good question. I mean, as I said, in her youth, she was trying to model on her poem on Poe. She doesn't have any poetry that I'm aware of, but she clearly enjoys it. I mean, evoking Emily Dickinson and Shakespeare, obviously writing, but yeah, I don't know. I think there are spaces in between the pages of, do I have my copy of Gilead ready to hand? There are spaces on the pages within the text. Not so much in here, but in Gilead, I don't know where it is. Probably lent it to someone, but there are just sort of these gaps in the pages where you're sort of like, you read a little vignette and you're like, oh, what was that about? What was there? So she sort of builds into even her fiction, I think, these little pauses. So they're kind of like long prose poems more than anything else. Some of her work in Gilead, I think.
I think in housekeeping too. I mean, if it is possible to, write a long prose poem, as long as housekeeping, this would be as close as you could get, probably.
There's a spareness to the writing, kind of like a Hemingway, that you're just you can turn to any page in here and read a few paragraphs and being like, whoa,
Wow.
this is beautiful writing here, because it's less about plot driven, like, oh wait, who's died so far. Like, it doesn't matter, you can jump anywhere in the text and find some beautiful almost prose poetry in there to reflect on and think about. So I mean, despite its thin length, I find it actually takes quite a while to read if you're going to read it well, and it's worth revisiting. So
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. This has just been a wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed the discussion and the opportunity to ask that kind of question. I think at this point I should turn it back over to Michael Scott for final remarks, or perhaps he has a question.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for that. It's been absolutely fascinating, and even that I haven't read Marilynne Robinson, but I've already got images, so I must correct that. But to hear the three of you discussing it and discussing her has been fascinating. So thank you, Joe, very much. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Mike, for being part of the conversation. And you better test me the next time to see whether I've read it or not. But I must get to it. Okay. This is the last event of this series in this academic year. We'll be doing a further series in the fall. Not quite sure exactly how we're going to stage that one, but we're working on that at the moment. The four of us. So look out, please, for information about what we're going to do later on after the summer. The next event in the Free Speech Project at Crossroads International Dialogues, that's going to be on Monday the 5th of June. Please note the change of day, and it'll be a very timely event because it's to do with democracy in the UK and the state of democracy in the UK and what it means. And I think there are going to be people talking about why do we have a royal family, why we've got a United Kingdom, what's the evolution about, what is the way in which we consider democracy to still be relevant within the UK. Later on in that series, we're going to be looking at it in the USA. Of course,
Michael,
next year.
Excuse me. Monday's the 5th of June.
Sorry, that's what I said, didn't I? No.
No, you said the 6th. At least
Oh,
that's
sorry,
what I heard.
Monday the 5th
Okay.
of June. Sorry, Monday the
Sorry.
5th of June. Sorry. Yeah, it is the 5th of June. Later on in the series, we're going to be looking at the USA. And of course, next year is a big year because it's to do with elections in both countries. The Free Speech Project goes on every month through the calendar year. This project is only going on through the academic year, but in August we're going to be talking about celebrity, and in July we're going to be talking about celebrity, and in August we're going to be talking about Afghanistan. So keep your eyes open for that, please. But today, thanks again to those at Georgetown. Thanks for the discussion. Thanks to you, Joe. Thanks to you, Catherine, and to you, Mike. Thanks to Julie Murillo and Mary Gordon, who worked to make the Zoom presentations possible. Joe, we look forward very much to seeing you in Oxford over the weekend to receive your doctorate. So we're looking forward to that, and thank you for inviting me to the celebrations. I'm all right, so that's terrific on next Saturday. So I hope it all goes well for you. Thanks to Dr. Jack DeJoya, Dr. Tom Banchoff. Without their support, none of this would be able to go on. Thanks to Nick Austin, the Master of Campion Hall, Ying Ying, our Campion Hall administrator at Blackfriars, Richard Finn, the director of the Lancasters Institute, and John O'Connor, the regent. My thanks as ever to Maggie for helping with the administration as well. Don't forget to join us on Monday, the 5th of June, for our discussion on democracy in the UK at 11 AM EST, 4 PM BST. Don't forget to join us when we start again in the fall with more literature, art, and perhaps the environment as well. Thank you very much. In the meantime, everyone, keep safe. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Thank you and goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.